welcome to the deep dive. We're diving into something a little different today.
Yeah.
Instead of looking at arguments for belief, like we often do,
Right.
we're flipping the script,
Mm-hmm.
looking at what's sometimes called atheological apologetics.
Okay.
So basically, how do you make a case for atheism?
Interesting.
You know, not just I don't believe, but actually building arguments.
Right.
And you sent over some really interesting material for us to dig into.
I did, yeah.
And we're going to be focusing on this philosophical paper
Okay.
by Scott A. Szulkowski from the American Philosophical Quarterly.
Yeah, it's dense, but it's good.
It is. And this paper really gets into the weeds
It does.
of how difficult it is to actually build a solid argument
Yeah.
to support the idea that God doesn't exist.
That's right.
And one of the core questions that this paper gets at, which I think is fascinating,
Okay.
is this question of the burden of proof.
That's a big one.
Right. So when we're having these debates about God, does the atheist have the same kind of burden of proof
Yeah.
as the theist?
Yeah.
And, you know, there's this common assumption that, okay,
Right.
if you're arguing for the existence of God,
Yeah.
you've got to kind of prove it.
You've got to make the case, yeah.
But this paper really digs into whether
Yeah.
that's always the case.
Whether the scales are tipped right from the get-go.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's start with this whole idea of the burden of proof.
Okay.
When we were talking about God's existence,
Right.
what are we even talking about?
So when we're talking about the burden of proof in these discussions,
Yeah.
a lot of folks bring up Antony Flew
Okay.
and his idea of the presumption of atheism.
Right.
And it's kind of like the starting point is no God
Yeah.
until somebody makes the case that there is one.
Right.
Right. So if you're making a claim
Yeah.
like God exists,
Yeah.
then it's on you to provide the reasons.
Right. So Flew is basically saying
Yeah.
the theist has to make the first move
Yeah.
and support that claim.
Yep.
But Szulkowski pushes back against this
It does.
quite a bit, actually,
Yeah.
and says, hold on, this presumption of atheism
Yeah.
isn't quite as simple
It's not as straightforward, no.
as it might seem.
Yeah.
And he brings up a few key arguments
Yeah.
against it.
Yeah.
And I think the first one is this idea
Okay.
that theism, just the very idea of theism,
Mm-hmm.
is somehow
Yeah.
intrinsically less likely or more suspicious.
Right, that there's something about the nature of it
Yeah.
that just makes it less likely.
So if it's less likely, that person should have to prove it.
Right.
Right.
Well, that's the assumption.
Is that what he's saying?
Yeah, that's sort of the underlying logic there.
Okay.
But Szulkowski really pushes back against that
Yeah.
and says, you know, just because something might seem unlikely to us
Yeah.
doesn't automatically mean it's false.
Right.
Or that the person who believes it has to sort of shoulder the burden of proof right from the start.
So give me an example of that. What's something that maybe...
Well, think about some of the really counterintuitive ideas in science,
Okay.
right? Like quantum mechanics, for example.
Okay. Yeah.
You know, when you first hear about some of the principles there,
Yeah.
it can go completely against your intuition about how the world works. But that doesn't mean it's false.
Right.
It just means our intuitions about what's probable can sometimes be way off.
That's a great point.
Yeah,
So we can't just base this on some kind of gut feeling.
right.
Then he gets into this really interesting discussion
Okay.
about what's called the intrinsic probability of contingent propositions.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to be honest. This is where I had to read it a few times
Yeah, it's pretty dense.
to really grasp what he's saying.
It is.
But basically, what he seems to be arguing is
Yeah.
we can't just assign a probability to something based on pure logic without any evidence.
Yeah, like just based on the concepts themselves.
Right, exactly.
And like which one is more likely
Yeah.
without even looking at the world.
And the example he uses, which I love,
Yeah.
is the white swan example.
Yeah, it's a classic.
Right. So if you're just thinking logically,
Yeah.
what's the probability of all swans are white
Yeah.
versus the probability of there exists at least one non-white swan?
Right.
Like, how do you even assign a probability to that?
You can't just based on the concepts.
All right.
You have to actually go out and observe swans
Yeah.
in the world.
Until you've done that,
Right.
you can't really say.
You're just speculating.
Right. One is more likely than the other.
Exactly.
So you can't say theism has a higher burden
Right.
just because it might seem logically less likely.
Yeah.
Okay.
Without actually considering the evidence.
So we can't rely on initial probabilities.
No.
So what's Flew's next point?
So Flew's second point has to do with knowledge and justification.
Okay.
Essentially, the idea is that we need reasons to believe things.
Right.
Especially big things like, does God exist?
Right.
So Flu's argument is that this need for reasons,
Yeah.
this general need for grounds for belief, puts the pressure on the theist.
Okay.
Right, because they're making the positive claim.
Okay.
But Tsiolkovsky makes a really interesting counter-argument here.
Okay.
He says, well, doesn't that same demand for reasons apply to atheism?
Right. Exactly.
Like, if you need good reasons to believe something is true,
Uh-huh.
don't you also need good reasons to believe something is not true?
Yeah.
Or to conclude that theistic arguments are flawed?
He uses a great analogy, I think.
Oh, yeah.
It's like if one political party,
Okay.
puts forward a bunch of ideas
Yeah.
and their arguments are all weak,
Yeah.
that doesn't automatically mean the other party is right.
Exactly.
They still have to make their own case.
They still have to put forward a good platform.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And I think that applies here.
absolutely.
Just because maybe the theistic arguments aren't convincing
Yeah.
doesn't automatically mean atheism is justified.
No, you still need to make a positive case for atheism.
Now, there's a really subtle point here
Okay.
that Tsiolkovsky brings up,
Yeah.
which is this question of,
Okay.
if theistic arguments fail,
Right.
does that justify atheism?
Whoa.
And his answer seems to be not necessarily.
Yeah, because, an argument failing doesn't necessarily mean the conclusion is false.
Right.
It just means that particular line of reasoning didn't work.
Right.
There might be other arguments out there.
Exactly.
Or other ways of approaching the question.
Now, the third reason he looks at
Okay.
is this idea that positive existence claims require proof.
Okay.
Which, I mean, on the surface, it makes sense.
It does.
If you're claiming something exists,
Yeah.
then it's on you to provide the evidence. But he raises some really tricky points
He does.
about how do we even distinguish between
Yeah.
a positive claim and a negative claim.
Right. Like, what's the difference?
So give me an example of how that gets messy.
So imagine, right, you make a list of everything you think exists in the universe.
Okay.
Stars, planets, people, whatever.
Yeah.
And you say, and that's it.
Yeah.
Now, is that a positive claim about everything that is real?
Yeah.
Or is that a negative claim that implies that anything you didn't list
Yeah.
doesn't exist?
It's hard to
It's
come
a
up.
really blurry line.
Yeah.
And it's not always clear which side of that line a particular claim falls on.
And then he also points out that the main reason we might say, okay,
Yeah.
positive existence claims require proof is to avoid being wrong,
Right. To avoid false beliefs.
to avoid false beliefs.
Yeah.
But that applies just as much to negative claims.
Of course. Yeah.
You could just as easily have a false belief about what doesn't exist. Like what?
Like, imagine thinking a certain species is extinct
Okay.
when
yeah.
it actually isn't.
Okay, yeah.
That's a false belief about something not existing.
Right. Or maybe you think Bigfoot doesn't exist,
Exactly.
but maybe he does.
Right?
So it's not just about positive claims.
Yeah.
This whole avoiding false beliefs thing
Right.
applies across the board.
It does.
And then he really emphasizes this idea that the burden of proof
Yeah.
is very context sensitive.
It really is.
And he uses the great example of, if you were to walk into
Yeah.
a physics department today
Right.
and say, I don't believe in electrons,
Yeah.
you would have a very high burden of proof.
You would, because there's so much evidence for the existence of electrons.
Exactly.
Right.
But back when the idea was first being proposed,
Yeah.
the burden was on the person saying, hey, I think these things exist.
Right. Because it was a new idea that needed to be supported with evidence.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's not some kind of universal rule.
It's not.
It really depends on what's already
Yeah.
kind of accepted
Within that particular context.
within that field.
Right.
Okay, so we've looked at these three initial points that Tsiolkovsky raises.
Yeah.
Then he goes on to examine some other arguments
He does.
before this idea of the presumption of atheism.
Yep.
And one of them comes from Michael Scriven,
Okay.
who argues that
Yeah.
theists kind of have this heavier burden because they believe in more.
Right. They're adding something to the picture.
They're adding something
Yeah.
to what we normally experience in the world.
Right.
They're adding God.
Yeah.
Whereas the atheist is like, I just see what's here.
Yeah.
But Tsiolkovsky, again, cleverly kind of flips this
He does.
and says, well, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Atheists also deny a lot of things
They do.
that people believe in,
Yeah.
right? Like maybe ghosts or superstitions.
Right. All kinds of supernatural phenomena.
Right. So they're not just going with the flow.
Oh.
They're actually kind of going against the grain in a way.
In a sense, they are. Yeah.
So by that logic, they would also have a burden of proof.
You could argue that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, then we get to the, I think, famous
Yeah.
Santa Claus analogy.
It's a common one.
Right. Which comes up in these discussions a lot.
It does.
And this is from Scriven,
Right.
who basically says, you know,
Yeah.
we don't just believe in Santa Claus.
Yeah. Not without good reason.
Because, you know, we don't see him.
Yeah.
We don't have proof.
Right.
So in the same way,
Yeah.
if the arguments for God fail,
Yeah.
then we should just default to not believing.
Yeah.
But Shulkowski really picks this apart
He does.
and says, you know,
Yeah.
our disbelief in Santa Claus
Yeah.
isn't just because we lack evidence for him,
Right.
but we actually have reasons to think he doesn't exist.
Yeah, we figure out the whole gift thing.
Right.
Yeah.
The parents are the ones buying the presents
Yeah.
and, like, leaving them under the tree.
Right.
So we have an alternate explanation.
We do.
And that's not usually part of the atheistic world view, right?
No, not usually.
It's not that we have some kind of smoking gun
Yeah.
that proves God doesn't exist.
Right.
It's more like
An absence of evidence.
an absence of convincing evidence.
Yeah.
Plus,
And this is important.
there is what some people would consider
Right.
religious evidence.
All right. Experiences.
Right.
Texts.
Miracles.
Yeah.
Which the Santa Claus analogy doesn't account for.
No, it doesn't.
Now, you might say, well, I don't find that evidence convincing,
Sure.
but it's still there.
His.
You can't just pretend it doesn't exist.
Exactly.
Right. Okay, so we've looked at Scriven.
Yeah.
Let's move on to another thinker that Shulkowski analyzes, who's Norwood Russell Hanson,
All right.
who argues that
Yeah.
if there are no good reasons for theism,
Yeah.
then we should just default to atheism.
Okay.
But he has a very specific way of thinking about what counts as
Right.
a good reason.
Okay.
He says, essentially, the reasons have to be
Yeah.
open to all
Okay.
and compelling enough
Yeah.
that they would force a skeptic to believe.
All right.
And Shulkowski really digs into this
He does.
and points out some problems.
Okay.
So what stands out to you about his critique of Hanson?
Well, first of all, I think this assumption that theists are just unintelligent,
Yeah.
if they haven't found universally compelling arguments.
Like they're just not smart enough
Right, exactly.
to figure this out. It just seems kind of dismissive.
It does.
Right.
Yeah.
And then this requirement for evidence to be, quote unquote, open to all.
Yeah.
First of all, what does that even mean?
It's really vague.
It is vague.
Like, what would that even look like?
And he makes this point, which I think is great, about
Yeah.
specialized fields, like, let's say, advanced physics,
Right.
or like ancient history.
Okay.
We don't expect every single person to be able to
Yeah.
look at the evidence and understand it.
Right.
Right.
We rely on experts.
We rely on experts,
Yeah.
people who have dedicated their lives to studying this.
And we trust their judgment.
So why should it be any different for belief in God?
That's a good point.
Why is this like super high standard
Yeah.
where everyone has to be able to immediately
Right.
grasp it?
And be convinced.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then Shulkowski raises another issue with Hanson's approach,
No? Yeah.
which is this idea that you have to kind of exclude
Okay.
certain claims from even being considered as evidence.
Right.
Like, for example,
Yeah.
if you're debating the existence of God,
Uh-huh.
Hanson says, well, you can't just say, well, God spoke to Abraham,
Right.
because that's assuming what you're trying to prove.
Yeah. That's circular
It-
reasoning.
Begging the question.
Yeah.
But Shulkowski says, well, we do that all the time in other areas.
We do.
Right.
Like, if you see footprints,
Yeah.
you can infer that something made those footprints,
Right.
even though you haven't seen the creature itself.
Right. You're not just going to dismiss the footprints as like, well, that's just assuming
Right.
that a creature exists.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So he's saying we routinely
We do.
use observations that are related to something
Yeah.
to make a case for its existence.
Right.
So why this different standard for God?
It's a good question.
And then finally, with Hanson,
Yeah.
there's this idea that
Okay.
the reasons for theism must be compelling enough
Yeah.
to overcome someone's skepticism.
Okay.
But Shulkowski says, well, hold on.
Yeah.
That skepticism itself could be based on
Yeah.
all sorts of other beliefs or biases.
Right. Psychological factor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So just because someone's not convinced
Yeah.
doesn't automatically mean the evidence is bad.
No, it doesn't.
Right.
No.
And Hanson himself, I think, admits that.
Yeah.
His view might just be his own personal,
Right, his own subjective perspective.
perspective
Yeah.
based on his knowledge.
Right.
But even then, Schakowsky makes a point
Okay.
that even if we don't have good theistic arguments,
Right.
that doesn't mean atheism automatically wins.
Yeah, good
There's
point.
another option.
Just agnosticism.
Right.
Just saying, I don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
And he uses the Loch Ness Monster
Just a good example.
as a good example.
Yeah.
We don't have good evidence it exists.
Right.
But that doesn't mean we should say, well, it definitely doesn't exist.
No, we might just say we don't know.
We just don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've gone through all this.
We have.
Schakowsky's pretty thoroughly debunked this idea
Yeah. He spoke to a lot of holes in it.
of an automatic presumption of atheism.
Right.
Now, he shifts gears and says, okay, let's look at the challenges that atheists face
Right.
when they try to make a positive case
Okay.
for atheism.
Right. A deductive argument.
A deductive argument, right?
Yeah.
To prove that God doesn't exist.
Okay.
So this is where it gets really tricky, I think.
It does.
So what are some of the ways that someone might try to
Yeah.
deductively prove God doesn't exist?
So the first way is to kind of go after all the theistic arguments
Okay.
and try to show that they all fail.
Okay, so just debunk every argument for God.
Right, exactly.
Right.
And if you could successfully do that,
Yeah.
you might think, well, okay, that shows God doesn't exist.
Right, because no arguments for him work.
But what Schakowsky points out is
Yeah.
even if you were successful
Yeah.
in tearing down every single theistic argument,
Yeah.
all you've really shown is that those particular arguments are not sound.
Right.
They don't logically lead to their conclusion.
Yeah.
You haven't actually proven that God doesn't exist.
Right. You've just shown that those particular ways of arguing for it
Work.
don't work.
He uses a good analogy here, too, about
Oh, yeah?
it's like if you have a court case
Okay.
and the prosecution
Yeah.
just has really weak arguments,
Yeah.
that doesn't automatically mean the defendant is innocent.
Exactly.
It just means they haven't made a good case.
They haven't met their burden of proof.
Yeah.
Okay, so debunking arguments isn't enough.
Not to prove God doesn't exist? No.
What's another approach?
Another approach is to try to demonstrate that the very idea of God,
Okay.
with all the attributes that we typically ascribe to God, is internally contradictory
Okay.
or logically impossible.
So, like, if you could show that the very concept of God
Yeah.
just doesn't make sense.
Logically, yeah.
Okay.
That would be a much stronger argument.
Right.
But that's a really, really difficult thing to do.
Why?
Well, for one thing, there's just so much diversity in how God is conceived across different religions.
Different religion.
And even within the same religion.
Right.
Right.
Even within Christianity.
Yeah.
You've got different denominations,
Absolutely.
different theologians,
With slightly different conceptions of God.
slightly different conceptions of God.
Yeah.
So he gives this example of,
Yeah.
omnipotence versus almightiness.
Yeah, like, are those exactly the same thing?
Are those the same thing?
It's not entirely clear.
Right. And so if your argument against God
Yeah.
depends on a very specific understanding of one of those attributes,
Yeah.
it might not apply to all the other ones.
Exactly.
Right.
You might successfully argue against one very specific version of God,
Right.
but that doesn't mean you've ruled out all the other possibilities.
Okay, so that one's really difficult.
It is.
What's the third approach?
So the third approach is to try to show that theism conflicts
Yeah.
with contingent facts about the world.
So things we know from experience.
Right, things we observe.
And what's a classic example of that?
A classic example is the problem of evil.
Right.
The idea that if God is all good
Yeah.
and all powerful,
Yeah.
why is there so much suffering in the world?
Right.
You're right.
Shouldn't he be able to stop it?
Exactly.
Okay, so that seems like a pretty
Yeah.
powerful argument.
On the surface.
Right.
Yeah.
But Schakowsky, again, points out problems.
He does.
What are some of those problems?
Well, for one thing, again, a lot of these arguments
Yeah?
rely on very specific attributes of God,
Okay.
like perfect goodness,
Right.
unlimited power.
And if those aren't essential to your concept of God,
Yeah, then the argument might not apply.
and the argument doesn't apply.
Exactly.
Right.
And then there's also the fact that there's a whole field of philosophy
Okay.
called theodicy.
Yeah. Which is specifically dedicated to trying to reconcile the existence of God
Right.
with the existence of evil.
Yeah. So clearly it's not a universally accepted
Contradiction.
logical contradiction.
Yeah. Okay, so those three deductive approaches
Yeah,
seem to face
a lot of challenge.
pretty big challenges.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's Shulkowski's next move?
So next he looks at whether you could argue for atheism
Okay,
by either proving materialism,
okay,
the idea that only the physical world exists,
okay.
or by offering alternate explanations for things that theists usually attribute to God.
Okay.
So it's kind of like